Margaret Maggie. Callahan gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, as she navigated the twisting roads of Asheville, North Carolina. The truck lurched as a gust of wind slammed against it, rain pelting the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the skeletal trees clawing at the darkness along Tunnel Road. She'd just finished a 24-hour shift at the firehouse, battling a blaze that nearly claimed a warehouse, and now this storm threatened to swallow her whole. A branch snapped free, hurtling toward her truck. She swerved, heart pounding, tires screeching on wet asphalt, the world a blur of chaos and shadow. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. The storm had come out of nowhere, a beast unleashed upon the quiet mountain town. Maggie's eyes burned with fatigue, her body aching from hours of hauling hoses and shouting orders over the roar of flames. At 45, she'd seen her share of emergencies, but tonight felt different, darker, heavier, as if the heavens themselves were testing her resolve. The wipers thumped rhythmically, a hypnotic pulse against the deluge, barely clearing the glass before another sheet of water obscured her view. She leaned forward, squinting through the haze, her breath fogging in the chilly cab. Almost home, she thought, the words a fragile lifeline in her mind. She'd lived alone at her cabin on the edge of Asheville for 5 years, ever since Tom's heart gave out one quiet Sunday morning. The silence of that house had become her companion, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator or the occasional crackle of the fireplace. Tonight, though, the storm filled that void, with its howling, relentless fury, a symphony of wind and water that drowned out her thoughts. Maggie's hands tightened on the wheel as she took the familiar bend near Biltmore Avenue, the streetlights flickering like dying stars. She was bone-tired, her shoulders slumped, her uniform still reeking of smoke and sweat. Just a few more miles, she told herself, picturing the warmth of her couch, the soft glow of the lamp she always left on. Then something caught her eye, a flicker of movement on the roadside, small and dark against the glistening asphalt. She squinted, her firefighter's instincts kicking in despite her exhaustion. Was it debris? A trick of the light? She eased her foot onto the brake, the truck slowing as she pulled onto the shoulder. For a moment, she sat there, rain drumming on the roof, her breath shallow. She should drive on. It was nothing, probably just a sodden leaf or a piece of trash tossed by the wind. But 15 years of rescue work had taught her to trust her gut, and something about that shape tugged at her, a whisper of unease she couldn't ignore. Grabbing her flashlight from the glove compartment, Maggie stepped out into the downpour. The cold hit her like a slap, rain soaking through her shirt in seconds, plastering her short graying hair to her scalp. She barely noticed, her focus narrowing as she approached the mysterious form. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness and her heart clenched. There, curled into a pitiful ball, was a tiny creature, its fur matted and dripping, its body so small it looked more like a drowned rat than anything alive. A puppy, she thought, though it was hard to tell beneath the wet mess. As she crouched down, it lifted its head barely, and let out the weakest whimper she'd ever heard, a sound so faint it nearly drowned in the storm's roar. "Hey there, little one," Maggie said softly, her voice rough but tender. She shrugged off her jacket, the fabric heavy with rain, and wrapped it around the trembling thing, cradling it against her chest. It didn't resist, too weak to fight. its rapid heartbeat fluttering against her palm. She stood, shielding it from the wind, her own breath catching as she realized how fragile it was. Where had it come from? Who would abandon something so helpless in a storm like this? She hurried back to the truck, sliding into the driver's seat with the bundle in her arms, and cranked the heat to full blast. "You're gonna be okay," she murmured, glancing down at the soggy lump as she steered with one hand. The warmth began to fill the cab, and she felt the creature shift slightly, its shivering easing just a fraction. Up close, she could see its fur was a reddish-brown, like the cinnamon sticks her mother used to stir into apple cider every fall. "Cinnamon," she said aloud, testing the name. It felt right, a small spark of warmth in the cold night. "We'll get you checked out first thing tomorrow. Dr. Hayes opens at 8. I know 'cause Ruth's always griping about the early rush." Back at her cabin, a modest wooden house tucked among pines, Maggie carried Cinnamon straight to the bathroom. She grabbed her softest towel, an old faded thing she'd kept from Tom's fishing days, and began drying the tiny body. Beneath the wet fur was a skinny frame, ribs faintly visible and her throat tightened at the sight. Its eyes, barely open, were a warm brown, glinting faintly in the dim light. Working quickly but gently, she arranged old blankets near the living room heater, creating a cozy nest. She placed Cinnamon in the center, watching as it curled into a tight ball, still shivering despite the dry towel. Maggie sank onto her couch, unable to look away from the small form. Where had it come from? Was there a frantic family out there, searching in this storm? She'd check the local lost pet notices tomorrow. Maybe put up a flyer at the firehouse. For now, though, her eyes grew heavy, exhaustion pulling her under like a tide. Just as she began to drift, a sound jolted her, a tiny chirp, high and sharp like a bird's call, coming from Cinnamon's makeshift bed. Maggie blinked, sitting up slightly, her pulse quickening. It wasn't a bark or a whine, but something else entirely, something that didn't belong to a dog. The first hints of dawn were hours away, and the storm still howled outside, but inside a mystery had taken root, one that would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The first rays of dawn crept through the cabin's windows, painting faint golden stripes across the hardwood floor, but the air still carried the damp chill of the night's storm. Maggie Callahan stirred on her couch, her neck stiff from sleeping awkwardly, a dull ache radiating down her spine. The world outside was quiet now, the howling wind replaced by the steady drip of water from the gutters, a soft percussion against the silence. She blinked, disoriented, her mind sluggish from exhaustion, until a faint scratching sound snapped her awake. It came from near the heater, a tiny insistent tap of claws on wood. Maggie sat up, rubbing her eyes, and then she remembered Cinnamon. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The little creature she'd rescued last night was moving, its small body weaving through the living room with strange fluid motions that didn't quite match the clumsy bounce of a puppy. Maggie watched, her breath catching as Cinnamon paused to sniff a corner of the rug, its nose twitching like a rabbit's. Its fur, now dry, gleamed a richer reddish-brown in the morning light, though it was still matted in places, clinging to its skinny frame. She'd expected it to stay curled up, too weak to wander, but here it was exploring her home with a quiet determination that stirred something deep in her chest, something between awe and unease. Maggie rose slowly, her joints protesting after the long shift and the cold night, and shuffled to the kitchen. The cabin smelled of pine and faintly of smoke from her uniform, still crumpled on the floor where she'd left it. She cracked a couple of eggs into a pan, the sizzle filling the air with a comforting warmth, and set aside a small portion for Cinnamon. "Gotta get something in you, little one," she murmured, her voice rough from disuse. She carried the plate to the living room, setting it near the blanket nest, and crouched down, her knees creaking. Cinnamon approached cautiously, its oversized ears, oddly large for its size, swiveling toward the sound of her voice. But when it reached the eggs, it only sniffed once, its nose wrinkling, and turned its head away. Maggie frowned, worry creeping in. She'd fed plenty of strays over the years, cats Ruth dragged home, dogs left at the firehouse, but never one so young and fragile. "You need to eat, buddy," she said, dipping her finger in the water bowl she'd brought alongside the plate. She held it out, and this time Cinnamon responded instantly. Its pink tongue darted out, lapping eagerly at the droplets, its huge dark eyes locking onto hers, with an intensity that made her pause. Those eyes weren't just warm brown. They were too aware, too deep, like they held secrets she couldn't fathom. Maggie sat back on her heels, watching as Cinnamon finished the water on her fingertip, and then retreated to the nest, curling into a tight ball. Its tail, bushier than she'd noticed last night, wrapped around its body, and it let out another of those strange chirps, a high-pitched sound, more like a bird than a dog. She tilted her head, her brow furrowing. Maybe it was just weak, she told herself. Maybe it'd eat once it felt safer. But the chirp lingered in her mind, an echo of the oddity she'd heard before drifting off last night. She grabbed her phone from the coffee table, the screen lighting up with a few missed texts from Ruth Harper, her best friend at the firehouse. Ruth had been her rock since Tom's death, always ready with a laugh or a cup of coffee when the nights got too long. Maggie tapped out a quick message. "Found a pup in the storm last night. Weird little thing, makes chirping noises. Bringing it to Hayes later." She hit send, then hesitated before adding, "Think it's a German Shepherd mix." Ruth's reply came almost instantly. "Chirping? Sounds like you've got a new shadow. Bring it by the station. I want to see this weirdo." Maggie smiled faintly, the warmth of Ruth's words easing the knot in her chest. Ruth had lost her collie, Daisy, a few years back, and ever since. She'd had a soft spot for any stray Maggie dragged in. But this one felt different. Not just another rescue to nurse back to health and pass along. She glanced at Cinnamon, now tucked under the sofa's edge, its eyes glinting from the shadows. The house hadn't felt this alive in years. Not since Tom's boots used to thud across the floor, his voice filling the rooms with stories of the day. Maggie's throat tightened. She'd forgotten how much she missed that sound, that presence. She stood brushing her hands on her jeans and moved to the kitchen to pour herself a coffee. The mug warmed her palms as she leaned against the counter, her gaze drifting back to Cinnamon. It was awake again, stretching in a way that reminded her more of a cat than a dog, its legs long and delicate, its movements almost liquid. She sipped her coffee, the bitterness grounding her, and decided to try something else. She tore a small piece of turkey from last night's leftovers in the fridge and set it near the water bowl. Cinnamon's nose twitched, but after a tentative sniff it turned away again, retreating to its hiding spot. Maggie sighed, running a hand through her graying hair. She'd dealt with picky eaters before, but this was something else. something that didn't fit the pattern of any pup she'd known. She hummed softly, an old lullaby her mother used to sing. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." The tune came unbidden, a reflex from childhood, and to her surprise, Cinnamon stilled. Its chirping stopped, and it edged closer, curling against the base of the couch, as if soothed by the sound. Maggie's voice faltered, a lump rising in her throat. She hadn't sung that song since Tom was alive, since the nights they dreamed of a child that never came. She sank onto the couch, the coffee forgotten, and watched Cinnamon's small chest rise and fall. Where had it come from? Was there a family out there, frantic in the storm's aftermath? She'd check the local notices later, maybe call the shelter. But for now, she couldn't shake the feeling that this little creature had chosen her, or maybe she'd chosen it. The chirps started again. Softer now, a strange melody weaving through the quiet morning. Maggie leaned forward, her heart tugging in a way she hadn't felt in years. What was this thing she'd brought into her life? And why did it feel like it belonged here, in the emptiness she'd grown so used to? The sun climbed higher over Asheville, casting a pale light through the pines that framed Maggie Callahan's cabin. She stood at her kitchen sink washing the breakfast dishes, her hands moving mechanically as her mind replayed the night before, the storm, the rescue, that eerie chirp. Cinnamon was still under the couch, its reddish-brown fur barely visible, but its presence filled the house like a quiet hum. Maggie glanced at the clock, 7:45. Dr. Eleanor Hayes' clinic on Charlotte Street opened soon, and she needed answers, something to explain the oddity of this creature she'd taken in. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Maggie grabbed her keys and a soft blanket, coaxing Cinnamon out from its hiding spot with a gentle, "Come on, little one." It emerged slowly, its movements cautious but graceful, and she wrapped it carefully, feeling its warmth against her chest. The drive into town was quiet, the Blue Ridge Mountains looming in the distance, their peaks softened by a lingering mist. Asheville woke slowly after the storm, its streets littered with fallen branches, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and pine. Maggie's truck rumbled past the quaint shops on Biltmore Avenue, their windows still dark, and turned onto Charlotte Street, where Eleanor's clinic sat nestled between a bakery and a hardware store. Dr. Eleanor Hayes greeted her at the door, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. She was in her late 60s, a retired vet who'd returned to work after her husband passed, driven by a love for animals that time couldn't dim. "Morning, Maggie," she said, her voice warm but tinged with curiosity as she eyed the bundle in Maggie's arms. "Ruth texted me about your stray. Let's have a look." Maggie followed her into the examination room, the antiseptic smell mingling with the faint sweetness of pet shampoo, a familiar comfort from years of bringing rescues here. Eleanor set Cinnamon on the metal table, her hands moving with practiced ease as she checked its teeth, eyes, and limbs. "Well, now," she murmured, her brow creasing. "These teeth are sharper than I'd expect for a pup this size, and look at those legs, long and delicate. Not quite right for a German shepherd." She pressed gently along its spine, noting the way it twisted free with a sudden cat-like agility that made her pause. "How's it been acting?" she asked, glancing at Maggie over her glasses. Maggie shifted her weight, her hands stuffed in her pockets. "Doesn't eat much, won't touch eggs or turkey, just drinks water from my finger. And it chirps, Eleanor. Not barks, chirps like a bird. Eleanor's eyebrow arched, a flicker of interest crossing her face. She lifted Cinnamon's head, studying its eyes, those huge dark pools that seemed to see straight through her. Unusual, she said thoughtfully. I've seen a lot in my time, worked with wildlife back in the 80s, foxes and raccoons mostly. This one's got a look about it that doesn't quite fit a dog. She straightened, adjusting her glasses. We could do a DNA test if you're curious. It'd tell us for sure what you've got here. Maggie hesitated, her gaze dropping to Cinnamon, who'd settled back into the blanket, its ears twitching at every sound. I just want it healthy, she said finally, her voice softer than she intended. Don't care what it is. Just want it to be okay. Eleanor nodded, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. Fair enough. It's in decent shape, considering. A little underweight, but no signs of injury. Keep trying with the food, maybe something softer, like wet kibble. As Eleanor scribbled notes, Maggie's mind drifted. She'd been alone so long. 5 years since Tom's quiet exit. A heart attack that stole him between one breath and the next. The cabin had become a museum of memories. His fishing rods in the corner, her knitting by the fire, the silence that settled like dust. She'd thrown herself into work after taking extra shifts at the firehouse until a shoulder injury forced her into lighter duties. Retirement loomed, a shadow she didn't want to face. And now, this little thing, whatever it was, had stumbled into her life, filling the emptiness with its strange chirps and watchful eyes. She watched Eleanor finish the exam, her hands lingering on Cinnamon's fur. You've got a fighter here, Eleanor said, her tone gentle. Survived that storm somehow. Must have been meant to find you. Maggie's chest tightened, a mix of gratitude and something heavier. Fear, maybe. That this bond could slip away as easily as it had come. She'd lost too much already. Tom, the baby they'd hoped for, the life she'd planned. Could she hold on to this? Back in the truck, Maggie set Cinnamon on the passenger seat, but it didn't stay put. With a swift, graceful leap, it climbed over the center console, perching beside her with a poise that made her breath catch. Those eyes met hers again, deep and searching, and she felt a shiver run down her spine, not from cold, but from the weight of that gaze. Whatever you are, she whispered, her voice trembling with resolve, you're mine now. She started the engine, the rumble a steady pulse beneath her words, and drove home as the mountains faded into dusk, their peaks swallowed by the gathering shadows. Cinnamon chirped softly beside her, a sound that echoed in the cab, and Maggie's heart answered with a quiet promise. She didn't know what lay ahead, whether it was a dog, something wilder, or something in between, but she knew she'd fight for it. The storm had brought them together, and in its wake, a mystery was unfolding, one that would test her in ways she couldn't yet see. The morning sun spilled over Asheville, painting the cabin's wooden walls with a soft glow, but inside the air held a restless edge. Maggie Callahan knelt by the couch, peering into the shadows where Cinnamon had wedged itself overnight. A week had passed since the storm, and the little creature's fur now shimmered a richer reddish brown, its skinny frame filling out just enough to ease her worry. Yet its movements, those strange, fluid steps, still haunted her, a puzzle she couldn't solve. Today she'd take it to the firehouse, let Ruth see it for herself. Maybe a second pair of eyes would make sense of the chirps that echoed through her dreams. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. Maggie coaxed Cinnamon out with a soft whistle, her voice low and steady, the way she'd calmed nervous strays at fire scenes. It emerged, stretching its long, delicate legs in a way that reminded her of a cat unfurling after a nap. She'd bought a plush dog bed from the pet store on Patton Avenue, a soft blue thing with a chew toy tucked inside. But Cinnamon ignored it, preferring the dark corners beneath her furniture. She wrapped it in a blanket, its warmth seeping into her arms, and headed for her truck. The drive to the Asheville fire station was a short one, the streets waking slowly under a sky still bruised from the storm's retreat. The firehouse buzzed with its usual rhythm, boots thudding on concrete, the gurgle of the coffee maker, the static chatter of dispatch radios. Maggie stepped inside, Cinnamon cradled against her chest and heads turned. Ruth Harper, leaning against the break room counter with a mug in hand, grinned as she spotted them. "There's my girl and her mystery pup," she called, her voice bright with mischief. Ruth was a broad-shouldered woman in her early 50s, her dark hair streaked with gray, her eyes carrying the warmth of someone who'd seen loss but chose laughter anyway. She'd been Maggie's anchor since Tom's passing, the one who dragged her out of grief with late-night talks and bad coffee. "Let's see this chirper," Ruth said, setting her mug down and crossing the room. Maggie lowered Cinnamon to the floor, and it stood there, nose twitching, its oversized ears swiveling toward every sound. Ruth crouched, her knees popping, and let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be. Looks more fox than dog to me. Those legs, that tail." She glanced up at Maggie, her grin widening. "You sure you didn't snag a critter from the woods?" Maggie forced a laugh, but the words stuck in her mind, echoing Eleanor's hint from the clinic. She'd brushed it off then, but now, watching Cinnamon move, she felt that seed of doubt take root. The station's Dalmatian, Blaze, ambled over, his black-spotted coat gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He was the crew's mascot, a gentle giant who'd once leapt into Maggie's arms during a training drill. But as he neared Cinnamon, the little creature stiffened, its fur bristling along its spine. A low, guttural chirp escaped its throat, not a bark, not a growl, but something wilder, something that made Blaze freeze mid-step. His tail dropped, and he backed away, ears flat, confusion clouding his big brown eyes. The crew erupted in laughter. Eddie Martinez, a wiry rookie, clapped his hands saying, "That's one bossy pup." But Maggie's smile faltered. That sound wasn't right. It wasn't a dog's. Ruth straightened, brushing her hands on her uniform. "He's a funny one, all right. What's he been up to at home?" Maggie recounted the past week. Cinnamon's refusal to eat anything but water, its habit of stashing kibble behind cushions, the way it came alive at night, darting from shadow to shadow. "And this morning," she added, "I swear he smelled smoke before I did." Heater was acting up. Nothing serious, but he knew. Ruth's eyes widened, a spark of awe flickering there. "Like a bloodhound, huh? Maybe he's got a nose for trouble. You keeping notes on this weirdo?" Maggie nodded, pulling a small journal from her pocket. She'd started it after Eleanor's exam, scribbling observations in her neat slanting script. "Chirps instead of barks, hides food, moves like a cat." It felt silly at first, like she was playing detective, but it grounded her, gave her a way to understand this creature that had tumbled into her life. Ruth flipped through it, chuckling. "You're smitten, Maggie Callahan. This one's got you wrapped around its little paw. Or claw, maybe." Maggie didn't argue. She couldn't. Cinnamon had slipped into the cracks of her solitude, filling them with something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose, maybe, or just the comfort of being needed. The day passed in a blur of routine, gear checks, a false alarm call about a flooded basement, but Maggie's mind stayed on Cinnamon. She'd left it in the break room, curled up on her jacket, its eyes tracking her every move. By evening she sat on a bench outside the station, the mountain air cool against her skin, and watched the crew wind down. Ruth joined her, handing over a fresh coffee. "You're keeping him, aren't you?" she asked, her tone softer now, the teasing gone. Maggie stared at the steam curling from her mug, the question settling heavy in her chest. "Don't know yet," she said finally. "He's different, Ruth. Not sure what he needs, or what I can give him." That night back at the cabin, Maggie settled onto the couch, the fire crackling in the hearth. Cinnamon perched on the windowsill, its silhouette sharp against the glass, staring out at the dark Appalachia forest beyond. The mountains loomed like silent sentinels, their peaks swallowed by night. Then it came, that eerie yip, high and haunting, cutting through the stillness. Maggie jolted upright, her pulse racing. It wasn't a bark, wasn't a whimper, it was something else, something that didn't belong in her world. She crossed the room, her bare feet cold on the floor, and stood beside Cinnamon, following its gaze. The forest stared back, vast and unknowable, and for the first time she wondered if she'd brought home something wilder than she could hold. The cabin lay quiet under a gray Asheville sky, the morning mist clinging to the pines like a shroud. Maggie Callahan sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open to a page on dog breeds, German shepherds, huskies, mixes of every kind. But none matched the creature, now sprawled across her living room floor. Cinnamon's reddish coat caught the dim light, its body stretched out in a way that seemed too elegant, too deliberate for a pup. Ruth's words from yesterday, "Looks more fox than dog," echoed in her mind, a nagging whisper she couldn't shake. She sipped her coffee, the bitterness sharp on her tongue, and felt the weight of uncertainty settle over her. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. Maggie closed the laptop, her fingers lingering on the lid. She'd spent the morning searching, clicking through photos and descriptions, but nothing fit. Cinnamon didn't bounce like a puppy, didn't wag its tail in that eager, sloppy way dogs did. Instead, it moved with a quiet grace, its long legs carrying it from room to room as if it were stalking something unseen. She'd found bits of kibble tucked behind the couch cushions yesterday, wrapped in a corner of the blanket she'd given it, hoarding, not eating. And those chirps, sharp, bird-like calls that pierced the silence of her nights, kept her awake, wondering what she'd let into her home. She stood crossing to the living room where Cinnamon lay, its nose twitching at the air. "What are you, huh?" she murmured, her voice soft but edged with frustration. She'd tried again that morning, wet kibble this time, as Eleanor suggested. But Cinnamon only sniffed and turned away, retreating to its spot under the sofa. Maggie knelt, peering into the shadows, and saw those eyes staring back, huge, dark, and far too knowing. A shiver ran down her spine, not from the chill, but from the sense that this creature understood her better than she understood it. The phone buzzed on the table, Ruth's name flashing across the screen. Maggie answered, settling onto the couch as Cinnamon edged closer, its ears swiveling toward her voice. "Hey, how's your fox dog doing?" Ruth asked, her tone light but probing. Maggie sighed, running a hand through her graying hair. Still won't eat right. Hides everything I give him. And last night he yipped again. Woke me up staring out the window like he heard something I couldn't. Ruth chuckled, but there was a thoughtful pause. You know, I wasn't kidding about the fox thing. Ever look that up? They chirp. Stash food? Sounds like your guy. Maggie's stomach tightened. She hadn't wanted to go there. Not yet. Eleanor's hint at the clinic had been easy to dismiss, a passing thought from an old vet with too many stories. But Ruth's words, casual as they were, struck deeper, feeding that seed of doubt she'd tried to bury. He's just a pup, she said, more to herself than Ruth. A weird one, sure, but... She trailed off, her eyes drifting to Cinnamon, now stretching again, its movements fluid and predatory. Ruth's voice softened. You're attached, Maggie, I get it. Just be careful, okay? Weird pups can turn into weird problems. The call ended, leaving Maggie in the quiet, her thoughts a tangle of love and suspicion. She'd cared for strays before, kittens Ruth found in alleys, a mutt Eddie once fished out of a ditch, but none like this. Cinnamon wasn't just different. It was otherworldly, a piece of the wild that had slipped through her door. She hummed softly, that old lullaby. Hush, little baby, don't say a word. And watched as Cinnamon stilled, its chirping fading. It crawled out from under the sofa, curling against her leg, its warmth seeping through her jeans. Maggie's breath caught, a lump rising in her throat. She hadn't sung that song for anyone since Tom, since the dreams of a family faded into silence. She reached down, scratching behind its ears, feeling the thick fur beneath her fingers. You're mine, she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of defiance and fear. But even as she said it, doubt gnawed at her. What if Ruth was right? What if Eleanor's hunch wasn't just a hunch? She pulled her journal from the coffee table, flipping to a new page, and wrote, Moves like a predator. Chirps louder at night. Watches me like he knows something. The pen hovered, then added, Fox? She stared at the word, its starkness glaring back at her, and snapped the journal shut. That evening, Maggie cooked dinner. Chicken this time, hoping the smell might tempt Cinnamon. She set a small plate on the floor, but it only sniffed and darted away, leaping onto the counter with a grace that made her gasp. It perched there, watching her slice vegetables, its eyes fixed on her hands with an intensity that felt almost human. You know, don't you? She said, half laughing, half pleading. You know I'm trying to figure you out. Cinnamon tilted its head, then let out a soft chirp, a sound that seemed to answer her, or challenge her. She ate alone, the cabin quiet except for the hum of the fridge and the distant call of an owl in the forest. Cinnamon stayed on the counter, its silhouette sharp against the window, a sentinel in her kitchen. Maggie's chest ached with a longing she couldn't name, part love, part fear, of losing this strange companion she'd claimed. She couldn't let it go, not now, not after it had filled the emptiness Tom left behind. But as she watched it, its ears twitching at every sound, she knew the truth was creeping closer, a truth that might unravel everything she'd begun to hold dear. The cabin's stillness was shattered by the hum of Maggie Callahan's laptop, its screen casting a pale blue glow across the kitchen table. Outside, the Asheville night pressed against the windows, the forest beyond cloaked in shadows that seemed to breathe with secrets. Maggie sat hunched over, her coffee cold in its mug, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at the online pet store page she'd found. A DNA testing kit for animals. $79.99 results in 2 weeks. Ruth's words from the firehouse. Looks more fox than dog. And Eleanor's hint at the clinic gnawed at her, a relentless itch she couldn't ignore any longer. She clicked Add to Cart, her heart thudding against her ribs. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Maggie leaned back, running her hands through her graying hair, the silence of the cabin wrapping around her like a heavy quilt. Cinnamon lay sprawled on the floor near the heater, its reddish coat catching the faint flicker of the firelight, its bushy tail curled snugly around its body. She'd watched it all day, its refusal to eat the chicken she'd offered, its habit of stashing bits of kibble in the strangest places, under the rug, behind the bookshelf, even tucked into the folds of her old Afghan. And those chirps, high and sharp, echoing through the night, had grown louder, more insistent, as if calling to something beyond her walls. She'd resisted this moment, clinging to the idea that Cinnamon was just a peculiar pup, a stray she could nurse back to health and keep by her side. But the evidence piled up like storm debris, its cat-like movements, its aversion to blaze at the firehouse, the way it tracked every sound with those oversized ears. Maggie's journal lay open beside her, its pages filled with observations. Moves like a predator, chirps louder at night, watches me like he knows something. And that final hesitant word, fox. She'd written it last night, the pen shaking in her hand, and now it stared back at her, a question she couldn't dodge anymore. The next morning the kit arrived, a small box delivered to her porch by a cheerful mail carrier who waved as he drove off. Maggie tore it open, her fingers fumbling with the swab, as she approached Cinnamon, now perched on the windowsill, gazing out at the misty mountains. "Hold still, little one," she murmured, her voice tight with dread. It tilted its head, those huge, dark eyes meeting hers, and for a moment she almost stopped, almost threw the kit away and let the mystery stay buried. But she didn't. She swabbed its mouth, the process quick and gentle, and sealed the sample, her hands shaking as she dropped it into the mailbox down the road. The wait was agony. 2 weeks stretched like months, each day a battle between hope and fear. Maggie kept busy, shifts at the firehouse, knitting a scarf she'd never finish. But her mind stayed on Cinnamon. It grew stronger, its awkwardness fading into a lean, graceful form that moved with a quiet confidence. She sang to it every night, that old lullaby. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word," and watched as it curled against her, its chirps softening into a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. She couldn't lose this, she told herself. Not after Tom. Not after the silence had nearly swallowed her whole. The email came on a rainy afternoon, the subject line stark against her inbox. DNA test results. Sample number 2847. Maggie stood frozen in the kitchen, rain drumming on the roof, her pulse roaring in her ears. Cinnamon dozed on the couch, oblivious, its red fur glowing in the dim light. She clicked the message, her breath shallow, and the page loaded. Charts, percentages, a single line that stopped her cold. 100% Vulpes vulpes. Red fox. Not a dog. Not even part dog. A pure wild fox. She stared, reading it again, then again, the words blurring as her vision swam. A fox. Her Cinnamon was a fox. The storm night flashed back, the shivering bundle on Tunnel Road, the chirp she'd mistaken for a whimper, her blind assumption it was a pup in need. She'd been so wrong, so blind, seeing what she wanted instead of what was. Maggie pushed back from the table, her chair scraping the floor, and ran her hands through her hair. The room suddenly too small, too confining. A fox. Illegal to keep in North Carolina, she knew that much. The laws were strict, the penalties severe. Fines, confiscation, maybe worse. Her throat tightened as she pictured someone taking Cinnamon away, its bright eyes dulled in a cage, its chirps silenced. Guilt flooded her, sharp and cold. Had she stolen its freedom, pulling it from the wild where it belonged? She looked at Cinnamon, now stretching lazily, its movement so natural, so wild, and felt a pang of shame. But then came the fear. Losing it. The one thing that had brought life back to her empty days. She remembered Tom's laughter, the way it filled this house, and how Cinnamon's presence had begun to mend that hole. She couldn't let it go. Not now, not ever. She slumped in her chair, the rain a steady beat outside, and whispered, "What have I done?" That night, needing to clear her head, Maggie cracked the kitchen window, letting the cool air seep in. She turned away to pour a glass of water, but a sudden rustle stopped her. Cinnamon was gone. She spun around, heart leaping into her throat, and saw the window, open just enough. "No!" she cried, rushing to it, her voice echoing through the cabin. She grabbed her flashlight and bolted outside, the beam sweeping across the wet grass, her bare feet sinking into the mud. "Cinnamon!" she called, her voice hoarse, yet desperate. But the night swallowed her words, leaving only the rustle of leaves in reply. She searched for hours, the forest looming around her, its shadows thick and unyielding. Her flashlight caught glimpses, glinting eyes of a raccoon, the scamper of a squirrel, but no Cinnamon. Her legs ached, her voice grew raw, and despair clawed at her chest. Had it run back to the wild, answering a call she couldn't hear? She trudged home as midnight bled into dawn, her shoulders heavy with defeat, the cabin emptier than it had ever been. She collapsed into her armchair, red-rimmed eyes fixed on the door, willing it to open. Just before the sky lightened, a soft scratching broke the silence. Maggie's heart surged as she stumbled to the back door, flinging it wide. There stood Cinnamon, its fur damp with dew, its eyes bright and unknowable. It padded inside, leaving tiny wet prints on the floor, and pressed against her leg with a chirp that felt like forgiveness, or a test. Maggie sank to her knees, relief washing over her in waves, and whispered, "You came back." But as she held it close, the truth settled in her bones. This was no pup, and keeping it might cost her everything. The morning sun struggled through a thick layer of clouds, casting a dull light over Maggie Callahan's cabin. She stood at the kitchen sink, her hands gripping the edge, staring at the coffee she'd poured, but couldn't bring herself to drink. Cinnamon's escape last night, and its return, played on a loop in her mind. Each chirp a reminder of the DNA results burning a hole in her inbox. A fox. Her little companion was a fox, illegal to keep, a wild thing she'd tamed, or tried to. A sharp knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts, spilling coffee over the rim of her mug, and she knew with a sinking dread that trouble had found her. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thought in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Maggie wiped her hands on her jeans and crossed to the door, her pulse quickening with every step. She opened it to find Officer Henry Brooks from the Wildlife Protection Division standing on her porch, his uniform crisp, his clipboard stark against the gray morning. He was a tall man in his late 40s, his face weathered but kind, though his eyes held the firmness that made her stomach twist. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice steady. "I'm Officer Brooks. We've had reports of an illegal exotic pet at this address, a fox, possibly. Mind if I ask a few questions?" Maggie's mouth went dry, but she nodded, stepping aside to let him in. Cinnamon sat by the couch, its red fur gleaming, its ears burged as it watched the stranger with that unnerving intensity. Henry's gaze flicked to it, then back to her, his pen poised over his clipboard. "Several neighbors mentioned seeing what looks like a fox around your place," he said, his tone neutral but probing. "How long have you had it?" Maggie swallowed, her mind racing. "About 2 months," she admitted, her voice rougher than she intended. "Found him as a baby during that big storm in April." Henry scribbled a note, his expression unchanging. "And do you have proper licensing for keeping a wild animal?" Maggie's hands clenched at her sides. "I'm working on getting permits," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "He's tame, officer, completely tame. He wouldn't survive out there." Henry's pen paused, and he looked at Cinnamon again, now stretching with that fluid grace she'd come to know so well. "Mr. Callahan," he said, tearing off a yellow slip from his clipboard, "keeping a wild fox is illegal in this state, tame or not. This is your official warning. You've got 2 weeks to secure a permit, or we'll have to confiscate it." Maggie took the paper with numb fingers, the words blurring as she read them. "Failure to comply may result in fines and removal of the animal." Her chest tightened, a vice squeezing her lungs. "Please," she said, her voice breaking, "he's not dangerous. He's like family." Henry's eyes softened, just a fraction, but his tone remained firm. "That's the problem, ma'am. Foxes aren't meant to be family pets. There are laws for a reason. Safety, ecology, all of it. I'll follow up in 2 weeks. Get those permits, or we'll have no choice." She watched helplessly as he tipped his hat and returned to his truck, the engine rumbling as he drove away. Maggie closed the door, pressing her forehead against the cool wood, the warning crumpled in her fist. 2 weeks. 2 weeks to save Cinnamon, or lose it forever. She turned to find it watching her, its head tilted in that peculiar way as if sensing the shift in her world. She sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands, the weight of the truth crashing down. She'd known this might come, but facing it, really facing it, felt like a punch to the gut. The phone rang, jolting her upright. It was Ruth, her voice crackling through the line. "Hey, you okay? Saw a wildlife truck on your road. Everything all right?" Maggie's throat burned as she recounted Henry's visit, the warning, the deadline. Ruth cursed softly, then said, "You need help, Maggie. Call Eleanor. She'll know what to do. And that rehab lady she works with, what's her name? Clara. They'll fight for you." Maggie nodded, though Ruth couldn't see, a flicker of hope stirring beneath her panic. She dialed Eleanor Hayes first, her fingers trembling as she explained the DNA results and Henry's threat. Eleanor's voice was calm, steadying. "I had my suspicions," she said, "but I didn't want to push without proof. Legally, it's tough, Maggie, but not impossible. I'll send you vet records showing he's healthy, tame. Call Clara Nguyen. She's a wildlife rehabilitator I trust. She's dealt with cases like this." Maggie scribbled Clara's number, gratitude warring with her fear. "Thanks, Eleanor," she managed, her voice thick. "I can't lose him." Clara answered on the second ring, her tone brisk but warm. She was a woman in her late 50s, her voice carrying the weight of years spent saving animals and the scars of those she couldn't. "Eleanor filled me in," she said after Maggie poured out her story. "He's imprinted on you, raised too young to survive in the wild. I lost a fox once, years back. Couldn't rehab it right. I won't let that happen again. I'll help you build a case. Permits are rare, but not impossible if we prove he's non-releasable. Maggie clung to her words, a lifeline in the storm. That evening she sat on the couch, Cinnamon curled beside her, its chirps soft and rhythmic. She watched it sleep under the moonlight streaming through the window, its chest rising and falling, peaceful and trusting. "I won't let them take you," she whispered, her voice steel and velvet, a vow etched into the quiet. She pulled her journal close, adding a new entry. "He's a fox. Illegal. 2 weeks to fight." The pen shook, but her resolve didn't. The law loomed, a shadow she'd face head-on, for the little creature that had chosen her, and that she'd chosen back. The autumn air carried the faint twang of bluegrass music from Asheville's fall festival, drifting through Maggie Callahan's open kitchen window as she hunched over her desk. Papers spilled across the table, vet records from Eleanor, behavioral notes from Clara, videos of Cinnamon curling up on her couch, each a piece of her desperate bid to keep him. The yellow warning slip from Officer Brooks lay crumpled nearby, its 2-week deadline ticking down like a heartbeat. Maggie's hand shook as she typed the final lines of her special permit petition, the glow of her laptop screen etching shadows across her tired face. She had one shot to save her fox. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Maggie leaned back, rubbing her eyes, the cabin quiet except for the soft chirps of Cinnamon, who sprawled across the floor in a patch of sunlight. His red coat gleamed, richer now, his lean form a testament to the weeks she'd spent coaxing him to eat. Bits of turkey he'd finally taken, water he lapped from her hands. She'd gathered everything she could, Eleanor's detailed health assessment, Clara's affidavit on his imprinting, even a statement from Ruth about his tame nature at the firehouse. Videos showed him bearing kibble and cushions, sleeping beside her pillow, chirping for attention, proof he wasn't wild, couldn't survive out there. But would it be enough? The festival music swelled outside, fiddles and banjos weaving through the crisp air. A reminder of Asheville's heartbeat, community, tradition, resilience. Maggie had lived here all her life, raised on these mountains, married under their watch. Tom used to drag her to that festival, his boots tapping to the rhythm, his grin wide as he spun her in the square. Now, she sat alone, fighting for something new, something that had slipped into his place without her even noticing. She glanced at Cinnamon, his ears twitching at the distant notes, and felt a pang. Love, yes, but laced with fear of losing him. The next morning she drove to the Wildlife Protection Office downtown, her thick folder tucked under her arm, the truck's engine a steady hum beneath her nerves. The building was a squat brick affair, its walls lined with conservation pamphlets and faded photos of bears and deer. The receptionist, a young woman with a tight ponytail, directed her to Dr. Judith Klein's office. Judith was a stern-faced woman in her 60s, her desk cluttered with files, her gray eyes sharp behind bifocals. "Mr. Callahan," she said, gesturing to a chair, her voice cool and clipped. "I've reviewed your initial application. You understand this is highly unusual?" Maggie nodded, opening her folder, her hands steady despite the storm inside. "I know it's not ideal, Dr. Klein, but Cinnamon's situation is unique. I've got everything here to show why." She slid Eleanor's assessment across the desk, her voice firm but pleading. "He was found during that April storm. Tiny, helpless. I raised him from a kit. He's imprinted on me. Doesn't even know how to hunt." Judith held up a hand, cutting her off. Foxes belong in the wild, not in someone's house. It sets a dangerous precedent if we start making exceptions. Maggie's jaw tightened, but she pressed on, pulling out her phone. Please, just look at his case. She played a video. Cinnamon nosing Kibble into the couch, his chirps filling the room as he pawed at her for attention. Another showed him sleeping curled against her, his tail tucked neatly around him. He failed every wild animal test Clara ran, she said, her voice catching. He doesn't know how to interact with other foxes. A sanctuary would break him. He'd be alone, confused. He needs stability, routine. He needs his home. Judith studied the screen, her expression softening as she watched Cinnamon leap onto Maggie's lap, chirping softly. She picked up Eleanor's report, her fingers tracing the lines about his domestication. Non-aggressive, reliant on human care, no predatory instincts observed. Then Clara's affidavit, imprinted at a critical age, unfit for release. Judith tapped her pen against the desk, her brow furrowed, considering. Maggie held her breath, the room thick with tension, the distant festival music, a faint thread of hope weaving through her fear. I've seen plenty of well-meaning folks try to keep wild animals, Judith said finally, her voice measured. It rarely ends well, for them or the animal. Maggie's heart sank, but she leaned forward, her hands gripping the folder. This isn't about keeping a wild animal as a pet. This is about what's best for Cinnamon. He chose to stay with me, even when he could have left. She thought of that night he'd slipped out, the hours she'd searched, the relief when he'd returned. Please, Dr. Klein. Give him a chance. Judith sighed, setting the pen down. I'll review this thoroughly before deciding. That's the best I can offer right now. Maggie nodded, her throat tight, and gathered her things. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. A flicker of light in the dark. She left the office, the festival sounds louder now, banjos strumming a tune that felt like a lifeline. She drove home, her mind replaying every word, every glance, her hope fragile but alive. That evening she sat on her porch, the mountains a silhouette against the dusk, Cinnamon beside her chirping softly. She scratched his ears, feeling the thick fur beneath her fingers, and whispered, We're not done yet, little one. The air was cool, the festival winding down, but her fight was far from over. Then the firehouse alarm blared through her phone. A structure fire in Swannanoa Valley, multiple buildings involved. Maggie's heart lurched. She grabbed her gear, leaving Cinnamon with a hurried pat, and sped off, the petition's fate hanging in the balance as sirens wailed into the night. Smoke billowed into the Asheville night, an orange glow lighting the sky as Maggie Callahan raced toward the Swannanoa Valley fire. The warehouse loomed ahead, flames licking at its metal roof, the air thick with the roar of destruction. She'd barely had time to lock the cabin door, Cinnamon's questioning chirp echoing in her ears as she'd rushed out. Now strapped into her turnout gear, her shoulder aching from old injuries, she gripped the hose line, her mind split between the blaze and the fox she'd left behind. This was her life. Duty, danger. But tonight it felt like a test she couldn't fail. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. The crew moved fast, Captain Rodriguez's voice cutting through the chaos. Carter, Martinez, take the east entrance. Contain it before it spreads. Maggie adjusted her mask, the heat already seeping through her gloves as she and Eddie Martinez plunged into the warehouse. Smoke choked the air. reducing visibility to a gray haze, the crackle of burning wood deafening. They swept for victims, water blasting from the hose. But Maggie's thoughts flickered to Cinnamon. His keen nose, the way he'd smelled smoke before her at the firehouse. Could he have warned her now, saved her from this? A loud crack split the air above, the structure groaning under the fire's weight. "It's compromising," someone yelled through the radio. And before Maggie could react, a deafening crash shook the floor. A section of the ceiling collapsed, debris raining down between her and Eddie, cutting off their exit. Smoke poured through the gap, the heat rising fast, and Maggie's breathing quickened inside her mask. Sweat stung her eyes as she shouted, "Eddie!" But the radio crackled with static, his figure lost in the haze. They were trapped. Time stretched. Seconds bleeding into hours as the crew's voices called from outside, working to clear a path. Maggie pressed against a wall, the heat searing through her gear, her mind drifting to Cinnamon. She saw his bright eyes, heard his playful chirps, felt his warmth against her side during thunderstorms. He'd come into her life when she'd needed him most, a light in the dark after Tom, after the silence. The permit petition sat unfinished on her desk, Judith's decision still pending. What if she didn't make it out? What if she never saw him again? A hand grabbed her shoulder, yanking her toward a newly cleared opening. "Got you!" Ruth's voice broke through, clear and fierce. "Come on." Maggie stumbled out into the cool night air, ripping off her mask, gulping oxygen as the medics rushed over. Eddie emerged nearby, giving a shaky thumbs up, his face smudged with soot. The warehouse burned behind them, but they were alive. As soon as the paramedics cleared her, Maggie jumped into her truck. Hands trembling on the wheel, and sped home, her gear still reeking of smoke, her heart pounding with a need to see Cinnamon. She burst through the cabin door, coughing, her voice raw. "Cinnamon!" A familiar chirp answered, and he appeared from behind the couch, his red fur glowing in the dim light. He approached cautiously, nose twitching at the smoke clinging to her, then pressed his cool nose against her cheek, letting out a soft, concerned chirp. Maggie sank to her knees, relief flooding her, and pulled him close, her fingers burying in his fur. "You're okay," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We're okay." The near-death moment crystallized something in her. He wasn't just a pet. He was her family, her lifeline. She sat there holding him, the cabin's quiet wrapping around them like a balm. The fire had shaken her, but it had also sharpened her resolve. Cinnamon's senses, his nose, his alertness, could save lives, she realized, a thought that had flickered at the firehouse weeks ago. She'd fight for him, not just to keep him, but to give him a purpose, a place in her world. The phone buzzed on the table, a text from Ruth. "You good? Scared the hell out of me." Maggie typed back, "I'm fine. He's fine. Got something to tell you tomorrow." As the adrenaline faded, she shuffled to her desk, Cinnamon trailing behind, and pulled out a plain white envelope she'd missed in her rush. The Wildlife Department seal stark against the paper. Her breath caught, her hands trembling as she tore it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Her eyes scanned the first paragraph, heart thundering, then landed on the word, "Approved." The permit was hers, strict conditions, an outdoor enclosure required, regular checkups mandated. But Cinnamon could stay. She read it 3 times, tears blurring the page, and slumped into her chair, weak with relief. Cinnamon chirped, jumping onto her lap, his cold nose nudging her hand. Maggie laughed through her sobs, the weight of the night lifting, and whispered, "We did it, little one. You're home." The fire had tested her, but this was her victory, a bond forged in chaos and sealed in ink. She'd build the enclosure, follow every rule, do whatever it took. For now she held him close, the stars outside twinkling through the smoke-scented air. A promise of peace after the storm. The late September sun dipped low over Asheville, casting long shadows across Maggie Callahan's backyard as she hammered the final nail into the outdoor enclosure. Sweat beaded on her brow, her shoulder aching from the effort, but pride swelled in her chest as she stepped back to admire the work. The permit's conditions had been strict. 10-foot fencing, double gates, dig-proof mesh, but she'd built it all herself, a sanctuary for Cinnamon that stretched across half her lawn. Logs and platforms dotted the space, offering places to climb, while a shaded den promised retreat. Yet, as she watched Cinnamon dart inside, his red fur glinting, she wondered if it would ever truly hold him. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. Maggie wiped her hands on her jeans, the cool mountain air brushing her skin as she sank into a chair on the porch. The enclosure was a compromise, law and love intertwined, but Cinnamon didn't seem to mind. He explored every corner, leaping from platform to platform with a grace that took her breath away, his bushy tail swishing like a flame. She'd spent weeks on this, hauling lumber from the hardware store on Charlotte Street. Her hands blistered, but her heart full. The permit had saved him, kept him hers, but it came with rules. No public outings, regular vet checks, a space to honor his wild roots. She'd follow them all, she vowed, for him. Inside the cabin, though, Cinnamon still ruled. Most nights he padded through the special door she'd installed, a flap in the kitchen wall, and sought her out, curling up at her feet or sprawling across the couch's back. She'd wake to find him perched on the windowsill, his eyes reflecting the moonlight, watching over her with a quiet vigilance that felt like love. The enclosure was his playground, but her side was his home, or so she hoped. She scratched his ears as he trotted back to her now, his chirp soft and contented, and felt the knot in her chest loosen. They'd made it through the fire, the law, the doubt. This was peace, wasn't it? But peace was fragile. That night, as the stars pierced the velvet sky, a sound broke the stillness. 2 sharp yips, wild and unfamiliar, drifting from beyond the fence. Maggie stirred on the couch, where she dozed off with a book, her heart skipping a beat. Cinnamon's head snapped up from his spot by her feet, his ears swiveling like radar dishes, his body rigid. Before she could sit up fully, he leapt to the floor and bolted to the back door, scratching at it with an urgency she'd never seen. "Cinnamon, what's wrong?" she called, her voice thick with sleep, but he didn't stop, his chirps turning to high-pitched cries. Maggie stumbled to the door, her bare feet cold on the wood, and swung it open to the night air. Cinnamon froze in the doorway, his whole body tense, then shot into the darkness like an arrow. "No!" she shouted, grabbing her flashlight from the counter and rushing after him, her pulse hammering. The beam swept across the yard, catching the glint of his fur as he reached the enclosure's far corner. There, just beyond the fence, stood 2 sleek figures, wild foxes, their red coats barely visible in the dim light, their eyes glowing like small moons. They were beautiful, untamed, their muscles coiled as if ready to flee, yet they held their ground, watching Cinnamon with a silent invitation. Maggie's breath caught, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Time seemed to freeze as she watched the exchange, the forest whispering around them, a chorus of rustling leaves and distant owl calls. These weren't just foxes. They were what Cinnamon was meant to be, free, wild, unfettered by human hands. The thought stabbed her chest, sharp and unexpected. He took a tentative step toward the fence, his nose twitching as he caught their scent, his movements careful, deliberate. The wild foxes shifted, waiting, their presence a glimpse of a life he'd never known, a life of hunting under the stars, of instincts older than her cabin's walls. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm she couldn't quiet. This was it. The moment she'd dreaded since the DNA test, since she'd learned what he truly was. The wild called to him, a song she couldn't sing, and she couldn't stop it. She wanted to call out, to beg him to stay, to run to the fence and scoop him up, but she didn't. This had to be his choice, not hers. She stood rooted, tears welling in her eyes, the flashlight's beam shaking, as he took another step, then stopped. His ears flicked back and forth, catching some sound only he could hear. And slowly, deliberately, he turned his head toward her. Their eyes met across the yard, his gaze bright and piercing, hers blurred with salt water. The moment stretched, heavy with possibility, the night holding its breath. Then, to her amazement, Cinnamon backed away from the fence, his steps unhurried but sure. He padded across the enclosure, past the platforms and den, and made his way to her side, pressing his face against her leg in that familiar gesture of trust. The wild foxes lingered a moment longer, then melted into the shadows like spirits, leaving no trace but the racing of Maggie's heart. Relief crashed over her, a wave that left her weak and giddy. She dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around him, her tears soaking his fur. "You chose me," she whispered, her voice breaking with joy. She laughed, a sound raw and free, and stood leading him inside. In the kitchen she rummaged through the pantry, pulling out flour and sugar. A silly impulse, but she didn't care. She baked a tiny cake, barely bigger than her hand, and set it on the counter with a grin. "We're celebrating," she said. And Cinnamon chirped, hopping up to sniff it, his tail swishing. It was absurd, but it was theirs, a moment of sweetness after the night's storm. She sat with him, the cabin warm and quiet, and reflected on what had passed. His choice wasn't a cage, it was freedom, the kind only love could give. She'd feared losing him to the wild, but he'd chosen her world, her side. The enclosure stood outside, a testament to the law, but this was their truth. Maggie's chest ached with a happiness she hadn't felt since Tom, a fullness that mended the cracks of her solitude. Whatever came next, they'd face it together, a bond sealed under the Asheville stars. The October breeze swept through Asheville, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke as Maggie Callahan tossed a rubber ball into Cinnamon's enclosure. The fox watched it bounce, his head tilted curiously, then pounced with a precision that made her laugh. A hunter's grace, even in play. The fall festival hummed in the distance, its bluegrass tunes a faint echo over the mountains, and Maggie smiled, her hands tucked into her jacket. Since that night with the wild foxes, something had shifted. Cinnamon's choice had lit a spark in her, a sense of purpose she hadn't known she'd lost. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. Maggie leaned against the fence, watching Cinnamon bat the ball with cheerful chirps. his red coat catching the morning light. The enclosure had become his kingdom, a space where he could leap and prowl, yet he still returned to her each night, curling up on the couch or at her feet. That choice had changed her, freed her in a way from the fear of losing him. But the fire in Swannanoa Valley lingered in her mind, a memory of smoke and chaos where Cinnamon's keen senses had flickered as a thought. His nose, his alertness, could do more than comfort her. They could save lives. She'd mulled it over for days, the idea taking root as she rebuilt her routine after the permit win. At the firehouse, she'd mentioned it to Ruth over coffee in the break room. The crew's chatter, a steady hum around them. "He smelled that smoke before me," she'd said, her voice tentative but firm. "Back when the heater fritzed, and in the warehouse, I kept thinking, what if he'd been there?" Ruth's eyes had widened, her mug pausing mid-sip. "You're serious? Training a fox for search and rescue?" Maggie had nodded, the spark growing. "He's got instincts we can't match. Why not use them?" That morning she'd driven to the festival's edge where Clara and Nguyen waited near a wooded trail. Clara, with her weathered hands and quiet resolve, had brought papers, studies on foxes in Europe, their remarkable noses navigating terrain dogs struggled with. "It's experimental," she'd warned, her voice thoughtful, "but possible. His imprinting makes him ideal. Trust humans. Follows cues. We'd need control, strict guidelines." Maggie had agreed, her mind racing with possibility. She'd called Doctor. Judith Klein, too, the permit's champion who'd surprised her with cautious support. "If you can prove it works, I'll back you," Judith had said, her tone warming. "Show me data." Now Maggie stood in her backyard, a makeshift training ground, with Clara beside her. They'd set up a test, a scent trail using a piece of Ruth's old jacket hidden in the enclosure's den. "Let's see what he's got," Clara said, her clipboard ready. Maggie knelt, holding the jacket scrap to Cinnamon's nose. "Find it, little one," she urged, her voice steady. He sniffed, ears twitching, then bolted, his movements swift and purposeful. He darted past the platforms, nosed under a log, and emerged with the fabric in his mouth, chirping triumphantly. Clara scribbled notes, a rare smile breaking her stern facade. "That's faster than most dogs I've trained." Maggie's chest swelled with pride, a grin spreading across her face. "Told you he's special." They ran more tests, hiding scents in tougher spots, timing his searches, and each time Cinnamon excelled, his instincts honed by a wildness tamed just enough to serve. Clara nodded, impressed. He could work missing persons, even fire scenes. Smoke doesn't faze him. Maggie thought of the warehouse, the way she'd imagined him there, and felt a surge of purpose. This wasn't just about keeping him. It was about giving him a role, a reason beyond her walls. That afternoon she brought him to the firehouse, the crew gathering in the bay with a mix of curiosity and amusement. Ruth emerged with a mischievous grin, holding a tiny turnout vest she'd sewn, red fabric, a miniature badge stitched on. "Figured he's our mascot now," she said, slipping it onto Cinnamon, who chirped and shook it off, prompting laughter. Eddie clapped Maggie's shoulder. "Weirdest damn dog I've ever seen, but he's ours." Even Blaze, the Dalmatian, sniffed him warily, accepting his odd presence with a resigned wag. Maggie beamed, the vest a silly token, but the acceptance real, a family she hadn't expected. Later she took Cinnamon to the woods behind her cabin, a real test beyond the enclosure. Clara joined, setting a trail with a lost hiker scenario, a sock buried under leaves, a path winding through brambles. Maggie released him, her voice a quiet command. "Go find it." He moved like a shadow, nose to the ground, ears pivoting, never losing the scent. Minutes later he returned, sock in mouth, his chirps a victory song. Clara's pen flew across her clipboard, her voice awed. He's a natural. With training, he could outpace our best. Maggie sat on the porch that evening, Cinnamon beside her, the festival's lights twinkling in the distance. She scratched his ears, feeling the soft fur, and murmured, "You saved me once, buddy. Those dark days before you came. Maybe now we can save others." He leaned into her touch, chirping softly, an agreement sealed in the dusk. The crew's teasing, Clara's data, Judith's backing, it all pointed to a future she hadn't dared imagine. He wasn't just her fox. He was a partner, a bridge between her past and something new. The mountains stood silent, witnesses to their pact, as the stars blinked awake above. The October sky over Asheville burned with shades of amber and gold. A crisp chill settling over the mountains as Maggie Callahan sat on her back porch, a mug of cider warming her hands. 1 year had passed since that stormy night on Tunnel Road, when she'd pulled a trembling Cinnamon from the roadside, mistaking him for a lost pup. Now he dozed beside her, his red fur catching the last rays of sunlight, his permit tag glinting softly against his collar. The forest beyond her yard whispered with the rustle of fallen leaves, a quiet hymn to the life they'd built together, a life she'd never dared imagine before him. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Maggie sipped her cider, the sweet tang a comfort on her tongue, and let her gaze drift to the enclosure stretching across the yard. It was a masterpiece of her own making. 10 feet of sturdy fencing, platforms for climbing, tunnels winding through artificial hills, all built to the wildlife department's exacting standards. She'd spent those early weeks after the permit hammering and hauling. Her hands blistered, but her heart steady, knowing it kept Cinnamon hers. Yet he rarely lingered there beyond playtime, preferring the cabin's warmth, curling up on the couch or at the foot of her bed, his chirps a nightly lullaby that chased away the silence Tom's death had left behind. She smiled, tracing the rim of her mug, her thoughts winding back through their journey. The DNA test had shattered her illusions. He wasn't a dog, but a red fox, wild by nature, illegal by law. She'd fought for him through Henry's warning, through Judith's skepticism, gathering evidence of his domestication with a fierceness she hadn't known she possessed. The fire in Swannanoa Valley had tested her, nearly stolen her breath, but it had sharpened her resolve, proving Cinnamon's worth beyond her walls. And that night, with the wild foxes, his choice to stay had sealed their bond, a moment of grace she'd never forget. Ruth Harper's truck rumbled up the drive, its headlights cutting through the dusk, and Maggie waved as her friend stepped out, a thermos of coffee in hand. Ruth settled into the chair beside her, her gray-streaked hair catching the porch light, her eyes crinkling with warmth. 1 year, huh? She said, pouring coffee into a spare mug. Feels like a lifetime. Maggie nodded, her voice soft. It does. DNA shock, permit fight, training him for search and rescue. Sometimes I can't believe we made it. Ruth chuckled, sipping her drink. Made it? You two rewrote the rule book. That kid last week lost in the woods. He's home because of your fox. Maggie's chest tightened, pride mingling with gratitude. Just 7 days ago, Cinnamon had tracked a missing hiker through the dense Appalachia forest. his nose cutting through brambles where police dogs faltered. The firehouse had embraced him since, a vest-wearing mascot who stole treats from the break room, his chirps a familiar tune among the crew. Even Blaze the Dalmatian had warmed to him, their wary truce a quiet victory. "He's more than I ever thought," Maggie said, her gaze settling on Cinnamon. "Saved me first, then others. Guess we found our place." The stars began to wink awake, twinkling like promises kept, and Cinnamon stirred, stretching his lean body before settling closer to her side. Ruth watched, her expression softening. "He's your family, Maggie. Tom'd be proud. Hell, he'd have loved this little thief." Maggie's throat burned, a tear slipping free as she pictured Tom's grin, his boots tapping to bluegrass while Cinnamon darted around them. "Yeah," she whispered, wiping her cheek. "He would have." Ruth squeezed her shoulder, a silent anchor, and they sat in companionable quiet, the night wrapping around them like an old quilt. Cinnamon's ears perked at a rustle in the woods, his keen senses alert to the nighttime dance of forest creatures. He stood, his tail swishing gently, and gazed toward the trees, a silhouette against the fading light. Maggie watched him, that familiar question surfacing. Did he ever long for the wild, for the life fate had almost given him? She'd seen it in his eyes sometimes, a flicker of the fox he was born to be, especially when the wind carried distant calls. But before the thought could settle, he turned back, pressing his forehead against her arm in that peculiar way of his, neither fully wild nor fully tame, but uniquely Cinnamon. She reached down, scratching behind his ears, feeling the thick fur beneath her fingers. The enclosure couldn't hold him if he chose to go. 10 feet was nothing to a determined fox. But night after night, he stayed, choosing this shared life they'd carved out. "You're free, you know," she murmured, her voice a tender thread in the dark. "Always have been." He chirped softly, curling into a tight ball beside her chair, his warmth a steady pulse against her leg. Maggie's heart swelled, a peace settling deep in her bones. He'd saved her from the dark, those lonely years after Tom, when the cabin silence had echoed her grief, and she'd given him a home, a purpose. Ruth finished her coffee, standing with a stretch. "Better head back. Early shift tomorrow. You two take care, all right?" Maggie nodded, rising to hug her friend, the embrace warm and grounding. "Thanks, Ruth, for everything." Ruth winked, her boots crunching on the gravel as she left, her truck's taillights fading into the night. Maggie turned back to Cinnamon, the porch light casting a soft glow over them, and sat again, pulling her jacket tighter against the chill. The mountains stood silent, their peaks a jagged line against the starry sky, witnesses to a year of storms and triumphs. Maggie thought of that first night, the rain, the chirp, the trembling kit she'd cradled, and marveled at where it had led. Cinnamon wasn't just a fox, not just a pet. He was her partner, her light, a bridge from loss to life. The search and rescue work had given them both meaning, a legacy born of their bond, but this moment, the quiet, the closeness, was their truest victory. She leaned down, resting her hand on his back, feeling his steady breaths. "We belong here, don't we?" she said, her voice a whisper carried by the wind. Cinnamon chirped, a soft agreement, and nestled closer, his eyes half closed in contentment. The streetlights of Asheville flickered in the distance, a constellation of human warmth. But here under the vast mountain sky, they were home, together, exactly where they were meant to be. The story of Maggie and Cinnamon closed not with a storm, but with a gentle night. a promise fulfilled in the stillness they'd fought so hard to claim.